The concrete walls of the Führer bunker seemed to press inward as Adolf Hitler stared at the strategic map of Europe, his trembling hand tracing the red lines that marked enemy positions, closing like a noose around what remained of his thousand-year Reich. It was January 1945, and the illusion that he had maintained through will and rage for months that Germany might still achieve some form of victory, that wonder weapons would turn the tide, that the Allied coalition would fracture, was finally collapsing under the weight of irrefutable geographical reality. The Reich was surrounded, compressed from all directions by enemies who possessed overwhelming force and showed no sign of stopping until Germany was completely destroyed. The realization had not come suddenly, though Hitler would later claim to his increasingly skeptical inner circle that he had always known, had always anticipated this moment, had planned for it. The truth was more complex and more human. The encirclement of Germany had been developing for years, visible to anyone willing to read the maps objectively. But Hitler had possessed an extraordinary capacity for self-deception, for interpreting setbacks as temporary, for believing that his will could reshape reality. Now even that capacity was failing him. The Western Front had collapsed in a way that made denial impossible. American, British, and Canadian forces had broken through the Rhine defenses, the great river barrier that German propaganda had proclaimed impregnable. They were advancing into the industrial heartland of the Ruhr, the foundry that had produced the weapons for Hitler's wars, now being systematically encircled and neutralized. Field Marshal Walter Model's Army Group B, trapped in the Ruhr pocket, was being compressed into an ever-shrinking perimeter, its communications with Berlin sporadic and increasingly desperate. From the east, the news was even more catastrophic. Soviet forces had reached the Oder River, less than 70 kilometers from Berlin itself. The Great Offensive, launched in January, had torn through German defensive lines with terrifying speed, overrunning East Prussia, Silesia, and most of Poland in weeks. The Red Army, which Hitler had insisted was on the verge of collapse, had instead demonstrated an operational capability that exceeded the Wehrmacht at its peak. Soviet tank armies were racing across the North European plain, their advance measured in dozens of kilometers per day, their objective unmistakable: Berlin. In the south, the situation was equally hopeless. Soviet and Yugoslav forces had liberated the Balkans. Hungary had fallen, despite desperate German efforts to hold Budapest. Vienna, the city of Hitler's youth, where he had first nurtured his twisted dreams of racial supremacy and German domination, was under siege. Army Group South was retreating through Austria, fighting delaying actions that bought days when weeks were needed, bleeding divisions that could not be replaced. In Italy, Allied forces had broken through the Gothic line and were advancing northward. In Norway, German garrisons sat isolated, maintaining control of territories that no longer mattered strategically, cut off from any hope of reinforcement or retreat. In the Baltic, entire German armies remained trapped in the Courland pocket, forgotten by all except the men dying there, serving no purpose except for fulfilling Hitler's orders that no ground would be surrendered. Hitler stood before the map in the bunker's conference room, surrounded by his remaining advisors, those who had not been arrested in the purges following the July 1944 assassination attempt, those who had found excuses to be elsewhere, those who still believed, or pretended to believe, that service to the Führer mattered more than the reality unfolding across Europe. General Hans Krebs, chief of the General Staff, presented the morning situation report with the careful neutrality of a man who had learned that delivering bad news could be as dangerous as failing in combat. The numbers were staggering in their implications. In the West, the Allies had over 4 million men deployed, supported by complete air superiority and industrial production that could replace any losses overnight. In the east, Soviet forces numbered over 6 million, organized into multiple fronts that could conduct simultaneous offensives along the entire line. Germany, squeezed between these forces, could field perhaps 1.5 million combat-effective troops, many of them under-strength divisions padded with old men, boys, and men previously deemed unfit for military service. The disparity in equipment was even more severe. The Allies possessed tens of thousands of tanks, hundreds of thousands of trucks, aircraft that darkened the skies when they flew in formation. German forces were increasingly dependent on horse-drawn transport, their panzer divisions often possessing more horses than tanks, their Luftwaffe reduced to scattered remnants hiding from Allied fighters, flying only when weather or desperation allowed. Hitler's response to this briefing was characteristic. He raged against the incompetence of his generals, the betrayal of his allies, the weakness of the German people who had proven unworthy of his leadership. He spoke of counter-offensives that would split the Allied forces, of wonder weapons that remained weeks from deployment, of political miracles that would fracture the enemy coalition. His finger stabbed at the map in the bunker's conference room. His officers around the table maintained expressions of attentive interest, nodding at appropriate moments, taking notes that would never be implemented.
They had learned the choreography of these briefings: appear to believe, never contradict directly, find ways to avoid implementing the most obviously suicidal orders. But beneath the performance, many of them understood that they were witnessing the final delusions of a man who had lost touch with reality, whose grip on the strategic situation had become so tenuous that he was essentially commanding phantom forces in an imaginary war. The Western encirclement troubled Hitler less than it should have, because he had never fully believed in the Western Allies' commitment to Germany's total destruction. Some part of him still harbored the fantasy that Britain and America, once they saw the Soviet threat clearly, would make common cause with Germany against Bolshevism. He convinced himself that the Anglo-American advance was actually beneficial, that they would prefer to occupy Germany rather than let the Soviets do so, that negotiations were possible once they understood the communist danger. This delusion was fed by his complete misunderstanding of democratic societies and Allied war aims. He could not grasp that the Allied demand for unconditional surrender was not a negotiating posture, but settled policy, that the British and Americans who had fought for years to destroy Nazi Germany would not suddenly reverse course, that Roosevelt and Churchill's alliance with Stalin was based on the understanding that Nazi Germany must be completely defeated before questions of post-war order could be addressed. The Eastern encirclement was more personal for Hitler. The Soviets represented everything he had built his ideology to oppose. Slavic peoples he deemed racially inferior. Bolshevism he blamed for Germany's humiliation after World War I, the Jewish conspiracy he imagined controlling both capitalism and communism. That these supposedly subhuman forces were now crushing his Wehrmacht, were advancing toward his capital, were threatening to raise the Soviet flag over Berlin, this was unbearable from both a strategic and psychological perspective. He oscillated between denying the severity of the threat and demanding impossible counterattacks. At one moment, Soviet forces on the Oder were a minor inconvenience that would be swept away by the gathering of reserves. At the next, they represented an existential threat requiring the commitment of every available soldier. The lack of consistency reflected Hitler's mental state, his inability to process information that contradicted his worldview, his retreat into fantasy when reality became too painful to acknowledge. General Gotthard Heinrici, commanding Army Group Vistula and responsible for defending the approaches to Berlin, tried repeatedly to explain to Hitler that the forces at his disposal were insufficient for the task assigned. His army group existed more on paper than in reality,
a collection of understrength divisions, Volkssturm militia with minimal training and obsolete weapons, ad hoc formations thrown together from stragglers and service personnel. Facing these scratch forces were Soviet armies that had learned modern warfare through bitter experience, that possessed overwhelming superiority in tanks and artillery, that could coordinate massive operations with a competence the Red Army of 1941 had lacked. Heinrich's attempts to discuss realistic defensive strategies, to propose withdrawals to more defensible positions, to husband resources for the battles that could be fought, rather than squandering them on battles that could not be won, were met with rage and accusations of defeatism. Hitler's strategic vision had collapsed into a single imperative: hold every position, counterattack everywhere, accept no retreats. This was not strategy, but ideology, the belief that will could overcome material reality, that determination could defeat tanks and artillery. The Eastern encirclement was more personal for Hitler. The Soviets represented everything he had built his ideology to oppose. Slavic peoples he deemed racially inferior. Bolshevism he blamed for Germany's humiliation after World War I. The Jewish conspiracy he imagined controlling both capitalism and communism. That these supposedly subhuman forces were now crushing his Wehrmacht, were advancing toward his capital, were threatening to raise the Soviet flag over Berlin, this was unbearable from both a strategic and psychological perspective. He oscillated between denying the severity of the threat and demanding impossible counterattacks. At one moment, Soviet forces on the Oder were a minor inconvenience that would be swept away by the gathering of reserves. At the next, they represented an existential threat requiring the commitment of every available soldier. The lack of consistency reflected Hitler's mental state, his inability to process information that contradicted his worldview, his retreat into fantasy when reality became too painful to acknowledge. General Gotthard Heinrici, commanding Army Group Vistula and responsible for defending the approaches to Berlin, tried repeatedly to explain to Hitler that the forces at his disposal were insufficient for the task assigned. His army group existed more on paper than in reality, a collection of understrength divisions, Volkssturm militia with minimal training and obsolete weapons, ad hoc formations thrown together from stragglers and service personnel. Facing these scratch forces were Soviet armies that had learned modern warfare through bitter experience, that possessed overwhelming superiority in tanks and artillery, that could coordinate massive operations with a competence the Red Army of 1941 had lacked. Heinrich's attempts to discuss realistic defensive strategies, to propose withdrawals to more defensible positions, to husband resources for the battles that could be fought, rather than squandering them on battles that could not be won, were met with rage and accusations of defeatism. Hitler's strategic vision had collapsed into a single imperative: hold every position, counterattack everywhere, accept no retreats. This was not strategy, but ideology, the belief that will could overcome material reality, that determination could defeat tanks and artillery. The Eastern encirclement was more personal for Hitler. The Soviets represented everything he had built his ideology to oppose. Slavic peoples he deemed racially inferior. Bolshevism he blamed for Germany's humiliation after World War I. The Jewish conspiracy he imagined controlling both capitalism and communism. That these supposedly subhuman forces were now crushing his Wehrmacht, were advancing toward his capital, were threatening to raise the Soviet flag over Berlin, this was unbearable from both a strategic and psychological perspective. He oscillated between denying the severity of the threat and demanding impossible counterattacks. At one moment, Soviet forces on the Oder were a minor inconvenience that would be swept away by the gathering of reserves. At the next, they represented an existential threat requiring the commitment of every available soldier. The lack of consistency reflected Hitler's mental state, his inability to process information that contradicted his worldview, his retreat into fantasy when reality became too painful to acknowledge. General Gotthard Heinrici, commanding Army Group Vistula and responsible for defending the approaches to Berlin, tried repeatedly to explain to Hitler that the forces at his disposal were insufficient for the task assigned. His army group existed more on paper than in reality, a collection of understrength divisions, Volkssturm militia with minimal training and obsolete weapons, ad hoc formations thrown together from stragglers and service personnel. Facing these scratch forces were Soviet armies that had learned modern warfare through bitter experience, that possessed overwhelming superiority in tanks and artillery, that could coordinate massive operations with a competence the Red Army of 1941 had lacked. Heinrici's attempts to discuss realistic defensive strategies, to propose withdrawals to more defensible positions, to husband resources for the battles that could be fought, rather than squandering them on battles that could not be won, were met with rage and accusations of defeatism. Hitler's strategic vision had collapsed into a single imperative: hold every position, counterattack everywhere, accept no retreats. This was not strategy, but ideology, the belief that will could overcome material reality, that determination could defeat tanks and artillery. The Eastern encirclement was more personal for Hitler. The Soviets represented everything he had built his ideology to oppose. Slavic peoples he deemed racially inferior. Bolshevism he blamed for Germany's humiliation after World War I. The Jewish conspiracy he imagined controlling both capitalism and communism. That these supposedly subhuman forces were now crushing his Wehrmacht, were advancing toward his capital, were threatening to raise the Soviet flag over Berlin, this was unbearable from both a strategic and psychological perspective. He oscillated between denying the Having learned from Stalingrad that besieging surrounded forces was inefficient when those forces could simply be bypassed, the German divisions in Courland were not tying down Soviet armies. They were removing themselves from any meaningful participation in the war's final battles. But acknowledging this would mean acknowledging that Hitler's standing order against retreats was costing Germany forces it desperately needed elsewhere. And such acknowledgement was impossible in the Führer bunker's atmosphere of enforced delusion. The airlift that was supposed to sustain isolated garrisons and surrounded armies was failing across all fronts. The Luftwaffe, once the pride of the Wehrmacht and the instrument of blitzkrieg, had been reduced to scattered remnants by years of attrition and the complete Allied air superiority that now prevailed over German airspace. Promises to supply surrounded forces by air, to evacuate wounded, to deliver reinforcements, were made and broken with a regularity that had become darkly comic to the soldiers depending on them. Hitler continued to believe Hermann Göring's assurances about air supply capabilities long after everyone else had recognized them as fantasy. Göring himself, grown corpulent and drug-addicted, spent more time at his palatial estate collecting art stolen from across Europe than managing the dying Luftwaffe. But Hitler needed to believe in air power, needed to believe that technology and will could overcome the material disadvantages Germany faced. So he accepted Göring's lies and issued orders predicated on air capabilities that did not exist. The bunker itself had become a physical manifestation of the encirclement, a concrete box beneath the Reich Chancellery, where Hitler and his staff lived in artificial light, breathing recycled air, increasingly disconnected from the world above. Reports filtered down through layers of bureaucracy, each layer adding its own distortions, removing uncomfortable details, emphasizing minor tactical successes while downplaying strategic catastrophes. By the time information reached Hitler, it had been sanitized to the point of uselessness. Yet even sanitized reports could not completely conceal the reality of encirclement. The maps showed it with geometric clarity. The colored pins marking enemy positions formed an ever-tightening circle. The territories under German control shrank visibly week by week, then day by day. The space available for maneuver, for retreat, for any strategic flexibility diminished until Germany was compressed into a zone that could be measured in hundreds of kilometers rather than thousands. General Wilhelm Burgdorf, Hitler's chief military adjutant, tried one afternoon to convey the reality of the strategic situation in terms that might penetrate Hitler's denials. He spoke carefully, using euphemisms and indirect language, but his point was clear. Germany was surrounded by enemies possessing overwhelming superiority in men and material. The fronts were collapsing on all sides. Organized resistance was becoming impossible, and some consideration should be given to ending the war before Germany was completely destroyed. The response was immediate and volcanic. Hitler's face flushed. His voice rose to a scream that could be heard throughout the bunker complex. There would be no surrender, no negotiation, no admission of defeat. Germany would fight to the last man, the last bullet, the last breath. If the German people were too weak to win, then they deserved to be destroyed. Better complete annihilation than capitulation to subhuman Slavs and Jewish-controlled Anglo-Americans. This was the Nero decree made verbal, the decision that if Hitler could not have his 1,000-year Reich, then Germany itself should burn. He had already issued orders for the destruction of Germany's industrial capacity, its bridges and rail networks, anything that might be useful to the advancing enemies. These orders were being quietly ignored by most commanders and civilian officials, who understood that destroying Germany's infrastructure would doom the population to starvation and chaos, but would not prevent military defeat. But Hitler's willingness to issue such orders revealed the depth of his nihilism, his identification of Germany with himself, such that if he failed, the nation should not survive him. The personnel in the bunker during these final weeks represented a cross-section of those who had remained loyal to or trapped by the Nazi regime. There were true believers, like Goebbels, who saw in Germany's impending destruction a Wagnerian twilight of the gods, a dramatic finale preferable to the humiliation of survival. There were careerists who had risen through the Nazi system and had nowhere else to go. There were officers bound by oaths and tradition, unable to break faith even when that faith had become obviously misplaced.
And there were the fearful, who understood that desertion or dissent meant death from the SS security forces that still functioned with terrifying efficiency even as everything else collapsed. Martin Bormann, Hitler's personal secretary and the bureaucratic overlord of the Nazi party apparatus, spent his days managing the increasingly surreal communications between the bunker and the fragmenting Reich. Orders went out to armies that had surrendered, to officials who had fled, to territories already occupied by Allied forces. Reports came back that bore less and less relation to reality. The entire system was disintegrating, but the paperwork continued. The forms were filled out, the proper protocols observed, even as the world they described ceased to exist. Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister who had spent 12 years crafting the image of Nazi invincibility, now found himself in the impossible position of explaining catastrophic defeat to a population that could see Allied forces occupying German cities, could hear the artillery fire approaching Berlin, could no longer be deceived by communiques about strategic withdrawals and regrouping for counteroffensives. His propaganda had become so divorced from reality that even he, master of the big lie, struggled to maintain the performance.
The foreign reports that occasionally reached the bunker painted a picture that even Hitler's denials could not completely obscure. Allied newspapers and radio broadcasts spoke openly of Germany's imminent defeat, of the unconditional surrender that would be demanded, of the trials that would prosecute Nazi leaders for war crimes. The division of Germany into occupation zones was being discussed in conferences between Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin. The question was no longer whether Germany would be defeated, but how the victors would divide the spoils. Hitler's response to these reports was to declare them propaganda, enemy lies designed to weaken German morale. But some part of him must have understood their truth, must have recognized that the leaders of nations controlling the majority of the world's population and industrial capacity were making plans for Germany's future that did not include him. The encirclement was not just military, but political and psychological, the closing of any possible escape from the consequences of the war he had started. In early April 1945, as Soviet forces prepared their final offensive on Berlin, Hitler presided over what would be one of his last major military conferences. The Situation Report described Soviet forces massing along the Oder with overwhelming strength, American and British forces advancing from the west, now less than 200 kilometers from Berlin, the encirclement becoming absolute. The question implicit in every briefing was how long Berlin could hold, not whether it could be saved. Hitler's response was to plan offensives. Forces that existed only on paper would attack from the south. Armies that had already surrendered would relieve Berlin from the west. SS divisions that were fighting for survival in isolated pockets would somehow disengage and march to the capital's rescue. It was fantasy expressed as military planning, delusion documented with all the formal rigor of German staff work. The officers taking notes understood they were writing fiction, orders that would never be implemented, plans that bore no relation to what was actually possible with the forces available. But they wrote dutifully because the alternative was to directly confront Hitler with the truth, that his Reich was not just surrounded, but dying, that the encirclement was complete and irreversible, that nothing could prevent the final destruction except surrender, which Hitler would never accept. As the conference ended and the officers filed out, Hitler remained standing before his maps, his hands still trembling as they traced the encircling red lines. The bunker's ventilation system hummed, recycling the stale air, maintaining the artificial environment that was all that remained of the German Reich's command center. Above ground, Berlin was being evacuated by those who could flee, prepared for siege by those who remained. Soviet artillery was already in range, occasionally lobbing shells into the city as a preview of the bombardment to come. The Reich was surrounded, compressed from all sides by enemies that would accept nothing less than total destruction of the Nazi state. Hitler knew this on some level beneath his denials and delusions, but acknowledging it would mean acknowledging that everything he had worked for had failed, that his racial theories had proven false, that his strategic genius was an illusion, that the German people he claimed to lead had been led instead to catastrophe. So he stood before his maps, moving imaginary armies, planning impossible offensives, maintaining the fiction of command over territories that had already fallen. The encirclement was complete. The end was certain. But in the artificial twilight of the bunker, Adolf Hitler could still pretend that reality would conform to his will, that the 1,000-year Reich might yet survive his Führer's final delusions. Outside, the artillery grew louder, the Red Army drew closer, and the circle tightened towards its inevitable conclusion.